Hi, folks. Thanks for joining in. Hope you are doing great and most importantly, staying safe. I'm Prabhas Sirivadana from WSO2, and this is our 32nd Silicon Valley IAM meetup.
Hi, folks. Thanks for joining in. Hope you are doing great.
Today, we have Jasen Meece, who is the CEO of Cloudentit, and Łukasz, who is the head of product strategy at Cloudentit. We are going to talk about session and context, identity and authorization for the cloud. Over to you, Jasen.
All right. Hey, thank you all for taking the time. This session really is designed to talk through some of the evolution that we're seeing in the market space. And feel free, throughout the way to either fire up any Q&A and or drop us a note. We're happy to be responsive to it. Time permitting at the end, we may pop up a demo. The intent is not to make this a Cloudentit product pitch, really more to talk about what we're seeing from a market trends and dynamic standpoint. And Łukasz is joining us. He runs engineering as well and is head of our European operations. So we'll definitely kind of keep this thing both at a programmatic level as well as technical function. So, one of the things that we're seeing here, and this is a session we did for API days, is that as folks move through their kind of journey to the cloud, a couple things are really happening, right? Folks don't wake up one day and say, hey, I want to use the cloud. It's really become almost a necessity. And with that, it's driving a lot of API adoption. And, I've heard it said before, so it's not my quote. It's easy when you have one or two cloud instances and a handful of APIs. It starts to get very difficult when everyone's just starting to do their own thing. And so what we're seeing is, as folks move across the journey between heritage or legacy infrastructure, really to a VPC or managed hosted, which is kind of this in-between ground, they're really pushing towards some type of multi-cloud environment. And so we're seeing both a programmatic change on how folks deliver the code itself, but also the architecture and the infrastructure behind it, right? So as all this is starting to happen, you've got this 3x3 grid. What it's really driving is the deconstruction of those legacy applications and the leaning heavy onto the interfaces from a microservice standpoint they have, and specific at the API level. And we all know, digital innovation means a lot of different things to different people, but there's not a company today, especially if you start to think about the pandemic as more of a change agent, or more of an accelerant necessarily than just a pure change agent. It's really pushed everyone to adopt cloud and go full digital. So, even where folks thought, hey, we'll get to this, we're seeing a lot of these multi-cloud use cases really being accelerated. And with that, an ever more pressing issue to focus on the API and make sure that there's a keen understanding as to how you actually govern it, but make sure you've got the right level of access control. So what does that actually mean? So as we start to think about API and kind of cloud-driven native services, right, we're used to seeing from a heritage standpoint, tight integration. And so from that standpoint, the access control and authorization pieces from an identity standpoint could really be built right into the stack. Then we started to see a hybrid cloud environment where you started to have the UI broken apart from some of the back end, and we started to see APIs as kind of that center point. As we go multi-cloud, basically we see it completely deconstructed. And so if you can't do that securely and you can't do that at speed, then you really start to run into difficulty when you start to modernize. And we're starting to see this, I think Gartner's quoting APIs as the next big attack surface and 80% of the threats by 2022 or something like that. What we're already seeing this manifest is the concept of identity management or session tied into context, which is the risk aware ability of what's happening from a data lineage standpoint. The absence of that is leading to what happened to Walgreens, where all of a sudden other folks could see prescriptions. It's leading into some of the breaches. We've seen, folks leaving things and switches open inside of AWS, the large Capital One incident. So when we're starting to see this, folks are having to be much more mindful and at the API level, ensure that they start to have more control. And that's really what this session is going to be about. So when we start to think about the service requirements from both identity and authorization, a lot of time here to date has been spent on the authentication piece, which again is incredibly paramount. But as we start to look at the authorization, we're starting to now look at how this stuff is tied together. How do we start to have continuity between the two systems? And more importantly, in addition to just the business functions, what are some of the standards that lie underneath that? And specifically, how do we move from this concept of coarse grain to fine grain? And, I know we're going to have both a technical and business discussion here interwoven. So I'll give a business analogy, and then LJ, I'll throw it over your way for a technical assessment on this part, but start to think about it from an air travel analogy. So authentication is very akin to getting you to the right airport at the right time. Let's say you're in New York City and you need to go to Newark. You could take the train and a bus. You could take an Uber. You could take a Lyft. You could drive your own car, all kinds of different things. And it gets you kind of there in a rough way. Once you get to Newark, you need to get through security, which anyone who's flown in and out of Newark knows that in itself is an effort. But effectively, that's coarse grain authorization. Are you allowed to keep progressing? The next step for fine grain authorization is really akin to making sure you're at the right gate, you're in the right seat, and your gluten-free meal's with you. But more importantly, if something goes wrong with that flight, it automatically rolls you to the next one. And again, anyone who's flown out of Newark knows that's usually something that probably is going to happen. So looking at that whole system end to end, the fine grain authorization piece, and specifically around OAuth 2.1, is where we're starting to see a much bigger focus, specifically as we start to deconstruct some of these applications. LJ, from a technical enablement standpoint, anything you want to add to this slide?
Yes. So that's a really good analogy, Jason, and let me continue in that. Continue in speaking that context, so that like on this in the slide, we have multiple blocks here where we have the OAuth, that's one of the scopes, one of the blocks. So for a long time, OAuth scopes was perceived as one authorization measure. I mean, something that will handle the authorization in your system, right? And this is not. And while we, from the very beginning, we've been on the other opinion that in order you need to look at this more holistically. It's not only about setting like a couple of scopes and it's done, and moving the rest of the fine grained authorization to the app. For some time already, in many cases we've seen applications with fine grained rules coded into it, and it didn't play well because of the changes, audit requirements, and visibility into what is really hidden inside in the code, right? So we see it as the combination of, we see authorization as the combination of the OAuth for sure, right? This is the baseline, but additionally to that, we need to take into account multiple other things like user context and the user attributes, risk associated with a user, functions or APIs that you're exposing, and APIs and the API level authorization, as well as the fine-grained authorization. So what am I sending in the API? What in which context am I invoking some certain business function? That's all needed, right? But this is beyond something that a typical OAuth authorization server can provide. Which means that, and one thing that Jason also mentioned is the focus on multiple architecture types. So applications are not applications are not the same anymore, right? We have microservices architectures, we have monolith architectures, for many reasons that is still existing. So we need to focus on securing these APIs or multiple levels. So we think about the unique combination of all these things that can give you the sense of the comprehensive security, comprehensive authorization.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you, LJ. And where we see this starting to really manifest itself is this analogy to, from a DevSecOps standpoint, do you want to build a Snowflake or start to standardize, right? And we know the politically correct answer is always to standardize. You get more efficiency, it's repeatable. More importantly, you can do it in a secure way and make sure you get past the InfoSec team more efficiently. But the difficulty becomes you have to now start leaning into this concept of normalization, right? So we understand the reason for it, but sometimes for kind of rapid deployment standpoints, folks kind of push something out. So if the scope is different across all things from mail, email to address, you've got to make sure there's a way to normalize that, specifically when you're talking about the same thing. And so one way to reduce that attack surface is really to lean into that fine-grained authorization part. And we're seeing this really start to tease out both from a know your customer, how can you grow faster? So think about, the efficiencies and the ability to get through the InfoSec team to get applications out the door quicker. And then the kind of second side of that same coin is how to do that in a more pragmatic way and programmatic way that mitigates the risk, right? No one wakes up one day and said, hey, I need more cybersecurity. They're doing it to mitigate some type of risk. And one of the ways that we're seeing this is you really have to start looking at standardization. Anything on that one, LJ? Otherwise, we'll move on to slide 6.
Yeah, I mean, just move on, please. So
no worries. Yeah, so
you covered it.
Yeah, so what's the challenge?
Can we go to the presenter mode if possible? Slides.
So I lose my screen if I do that. So is it not coming through?
Oh, that's fine. Then it's okay. We can do like this.
Yeah, sorry. It tweaks my 2 monitors if I do, unfortunately. I've tried that one a few times. Sorry. Thank you. Good question though. So when we start to think about, what does this challenge really leave us at? It really has to do with this idea of the normalization of identity and authorization, right? So if you start to think about embracing the heritage environment, what it means is you have to integrate with the existing IDPs and basically the API gateway infrastructures that are there. It's irrational to think we're going to start ripping things out. And so as you start to decompose, you need to do it in a way that looks at how can we modernize a component of it, deliver what the business unit's asking for, specific in the identity space, and leave the legacy infrastructure in place from an automation and orchestration standpoint, and then decompose it pragmatically. And where, we've had a lot of struggles in the identity space over the years is so much time and money was spent on it. There's definitely some cost, but you need to find a way to enhance and expand as opposed to rip and replace. And those aren't just, adjectives to use in context. It's really to make sure that folks understand there's always going to be some integration standpoints. Embracing that heritage and coming up with a pragmatic way to enhance the pieces that are needed while you decompose the legacy infrastructure is paramount. The second big thing to think about is, and we alluded to this earlier, so the OWASP, API top 10 list basically have broken authorization as the top one and woven into a couple of the others that are top 10. And so what we're starting to see is identity management, not just as a legacy infrastructure function, but now also as a threat vector. We all know the passwords in part, but as we start to lean forward and move towards perimeterless and zero trust, we've got to find a way to make sure that we've got continuity or data lineage and don't have broken authorization. That broken authorization piece, where switches are left open a little bit too long or tokens are too long living, is becoming a significant threat risk. And so it's something that both the CISO is going to be mindful of along with the board, because it's going to start showing up as a significant risk to mitigate. So as folks on this team or on this call start thinking about modernization, that's a big piece. The other one, right, in Cal privacy for us in the States, GDPR a little longer in the tooth over on the other side of the pond, is, how do we start to think about privacy and consent from a compliance standpoint? Now, if you look at how you start to lean out, and we'll get to it in a bit more detail here, for a centralized policy enforcement, along with an immutable audit trail, which basically means you've got a record of everything at a transaction level, there are some standards that are emerging, right? And the crazy thing, especially for those of us who've been in the identity space for a long time, it's still the 3 A's. It's still authentication, authorization, and audit. Those 3 A's have been around for 20 years. It's not new. The way we deliver on it and the ability to lean into standards is what's really emerging and kind of being more modernized. But specifically, when you start to think about who has access to which data and how do you make sure that services can't somehow be tied together to give too much information on who I am. If I choose not to share my data and you have too much data stored about me under Cal privacy, it becomes a problem. So as we start to disaggregate this and look at enforcement of the policy at the API level, there's a big Cal privacy, basically ability for the business to sell value coupled with mitigate the risk on the back end. And then finally, as we push everything to the edge, always making a round trip back to just one centralized area is great for the policy, but you have to be able to push it out into a container or some other way out into the edge device to make sure it can be enforced. Otherwise, this round tripping, and we'll get to that in some of the architecture later on, can be a little too difficult. And then you have this massive latency baked into your solution, which becomes unacceptable to the business itself. So LJ, anything to add?
Yeah. So Jason, that's thank you for that. So that's exactly everything that is described in this slide is we've been looking at the market and we haven't been able to it's really, you know, hard to find a product that would like cover the first two things in a SaaS with a SaaS developer experience, a SaaS-like developer experience. So even though like and we feel that the the market needs basically something that that can be installed on-prem or in the SaaS, you know, regardless where your APIs are, because there are various use cases. You can be financial institution or a startup that doesn't require to have something on-prem, but this integration with your APIs, integration with your identity, and like putting something in the center of your security infrastructure, between your security infrastructure, identity, and enforcement. This piece has been, you know, missing in our opinion for a while, done right. And many like if you think about like OWASP top 10, for example, like the security pure security products were missing this authorization piece, because actually, you know, this authorization is something that hasn't been in their space, right? You had to integrate that with identity, with APIs, discover these APIs, and this OWASP top 10 is for APIs is a game changer, because like the broken authorization for functions that we talked about in the previous slide, and fine-grained authorization. It's mostly about authorization, really. So authorization is really important these days, and actually something that combines all these things that we have on the screen, a product that would combine that is something that is needed, right? I mean, that's there are some common things that needs to be handled, like the authorization of based on OAuth, like as well as the rest of the things that are on the screen here.
Yep, absolutely. So, you know, what does that mean for us from an identity standpoint? So we've kind of laid down the groundwork as to what are the macro functions, what are we seeing, where's the evolution? It really mandates that we rethink this concept of identity management and authorization. And kind of the punchline, which is also the title of the session, is you need to think about it, pun intended, in the basically venue of session and context, right? So if you start to think about session as the identity management aspect, in context as the appropriate level of authorization, you know, what can service A do, or who and what can touch service B, you start to see how this stuff will evolve, and also how you can leverage stuff from an infrastructure standpoint folks already have, right? So, you know, we know some of the both legacy and new emerging folks in the identity space, right? You know, we've got the Oktas from an authentication standpoint, we've got SailPoint from a governance, CyberArk from a privilege, as some of the bigger ones, coupled with, you know, Dichotic leaning into a different way of looking at it. We're now seeing some of the cloud providers like AWS Cognito lean in, Azure B2C lean in. And so regardless of where they are in the identity stack, you need to start thinking about how do you preserve session, and then really start to lean into the context, what's happening. Now, in certain cases, it's one of those basically inflection points where we're seeing the two come together. And so what we mean by that is the identity providers are trying to become more app aware, and the app providers are trying to become more identity aware. So what do we mean by that? The inflection is right at the API level. So you can't do kind of the next gen WAF, known as a WAF from Signal Sciences standpoint, if you now don't start to take in identity context. And so, you know, we're seeing Gartner start to lean into this. You know, OneTrust has started off from being, you know, more of a cookie and identity monitoring from a marketing standpoint. You see them kind of coming back this way, both for regulatory reasons as well as risk and compliance. And so start to think about identity in a new vein, in that you have both the session providers as well as the context providers from a risk standpoint. So, you know, as we start to look at this, you know, we've heard a lot about different standards that are out there. It really has identity management becoming this kind of inflection or center point, as we were just alluding to. So now the evolution of once you have session and context is basically continuous contextual authorization. And that's really where APIs become the center point of all this from a security standpoint. So more than just kind of opening them up, if you think about emerging businesses, so you've got open data, open banking in Europe and Australia and Canada, much further along than the States, but we're seeing a big push. Think about, how do you start to have access from like the application Mint? I only want to access one aspect of my Wells Fargo account, not everything about it. So how do you start to tie it down at basically the identity at a service level? We're starting to see this around logistics. We're seeing it around telco. So this whole open data kind of movement where APIs are the connection point. You can see where we're going with this on the risk. Also, there's a lot of legacy IDPs out there. So we've got to make sure that the context is relevant. RBAC, great idea, sometimes difficult to deploy. Attribute-based access control, or ABAC, and then policy-based access control is the evolution as we start to move perimeterless, will continue to be a hot topic. And again, going back to the prior point, we must really embrace the heritage and not just kind of, check the box and say it's there and done. Consent and privacy. It's going to be a hot topic, right? We alluded to it earlier, but basically this concept of privacy by design or progressive consent is a term that a lot of the identity practitioners are going to start to hear more of, which is how do you make sure that the identity, be it a carbon-based life form as in a person, or if it's machine to machine, is aware, or if it's a bot, to do only what it's allowed to do. Application modernization, that deconstruction we were talking about before around microservices. And right at the end of it, it's all around data security and specifically things moving at machine speed. So if you don't have contextual authorization, it's difficult to start to show how the identity teams can help from dwell time and other risk mitigation standpoints. So, this bit is really evolving into this next slide here, which is continuous contextual authorization. So I'll pause here. LJ, if you want to add a little bit on technically how do we do some of this enablement, I'll then circle back and close out. Where do we see the market evolving here?
Yeah, so the first thing that I'll start with is that this is something that I was trying to explain in the previous, having occasion speaking about the previous slide. So this commodity that is on the left hand side is actually something that is available on the market, like ABAC, airbag, PBAC entitlements. But I would also add here something that is in the OAuth, although the OAuth is mentioned in the center column. This is like the market got used to, some standards or some typical solutions of particular problems, and now we're at the moment where it's time to move on, and we're moving on. Like the world has lots of APIs. There's lots of APIs that each service is exposing. Data sharing is really common. It got really common, and sometimes in many countries now it's getting super common and mandatory by regulation, where a bank, like in EU, banks need to share your data, or they need to have capability to share your data, and then along with that, it's not about function of sharing, but also security of sharing of this data, about your privacy, about being able to track, with whom you share the data, or with more technically, which scope is responsible, or is a control of data sharing for some specific data element, right? So you need to take governance into account. You need to take into account the consents, all the regulatory requirements. That is this column in the middle speaks about, and there is also, like, when I mentioned OAuth here in this context, OAuth evolved as well, but because there is many specifications built around it. One of those is this financial FAPI requirements, FAPI specifications, like the ones like KYC one, that is about the data sharing. So not like having this capability currently is not like super common, of course, but it will be in demand really soon. Like it will move to common at some point of time. Well, and the rest of these things, like on the right hand side that you see, like the OWASP API top 10. So even if you, so this is still to come, or it's going to be getting common in the next like five years probably. That you will need to not only provide a function like be able to control with whom you're sharing the data, but also you should be able, like by default, to just track how this data, or track this, like who has been or apply some analytics to that, and be able to discover in an intelligent fashion any data leaks or attempts to like fool the authorization that you have, basically. So we believe you should get this in a package.
Absolutely.
It should be commodity.
Exactly. And it's kind of the evolution, right? To look at it in a different way. If we start to look at from a speed standpoint, because that's obviously driving it. No business says, hey, can we go a little bit slower and less securely? What LJ just aptly pointed out from a function standpoint is we need to avoid a lot of the backhaul. This is that concept that we all hear overplayed of either zero trust or perimeterless. But the only way you can do it is to really start to adopt cloud native architectures and not have everything coming back to some type of managed, hosted, legacy-based environment that just happens to be dropped in the cloud, right? And this is applicable to all things cloud native. So it's not picking on any one thing, but you really have to pull these microservices apart, or you will not get this concept of east-west scale. Everything will still be north-south. And as long as it is, you may theoretically have more command and control, but it starts to fall over, both from a scale standpoint, but also from a costing standpoint. This is where all of a sudden you get yelled at by the CFO for having these wicked cloud costs because you're just running this stuff. And even though it's not overly performant, it's still running. So you got to pay for it. So this concept of, centralized PDPs and everything making a round trip call back to some type of managed hosting environment, we're finding just doesn't work at scale. It just doesn't. So as folks move multi-cloud, you really have to have everything distributed, right? And so if you look at, the stuff that's basically you got Kubernetes containers, you've got Lambda functions, Kong, Envoy are doing it, service meshes, but basically the whole design is to make sure that it's as light as possible, that you can look at the ingress and egress of all the authorization calls, but you actually push it out to the very edge device or inside of a container. So anything architecturally, LJ to add, otherwise we'll move to some of the structure here to do this.
Like most of the attacks comes from inside, right? So the cloud native architecture has its implications. And again, it's not only about decomposing an app and putting it on the cloud, but of course, so everyone should secure such distributed architectures, and that's what we believe everyone should take care of. But like we still see that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get all services in the world secured. Still, there's
exactly.
Not everyone cares about that, unfortunately.
Indeed, and really this goes back to that Snowflake or standardization. Obviously, the punchline is standardization, specifically from how do you start to externalize policy enforcement from the service itself, right? Because then it's repeatable and you can kind of stamp it out at a much higher level. And so, when we start to think about some of the core things that applications, and specifically when you start to connect APIs from an identity management authorization level, right, you've got to make sure there's micro-segmentation at the service level, but also going back to some of that heritage conversation, when we start thinking about the users, make sure that we aren't stuck with a whole lot of legacy RBAC or ABAC in place, because that will slow things down. You really have to start to get to PBAC or policy-based access control, kind of leaning out. One thing on that note, Gartner just released a hype cycle report, I think in July, around this concept of API access control, which is kind of this evolution of the space we're talking about, which is identity enabling the APIs and starting to look at them as both the enabler and the threat vector, right? This other one is this PII stuff, right? You've got to make sure that you lock down how much data can be seen or viewed by any specific microservice. Otherwise, you just open up the switch and folks, to LJ's point, if something was breached internally, you can start accessing all the data sets. And then finally, it's the entitlements, right? No news there, but instead of trying to have them hardwired or in some difficult kludgy way, start to have them abstracted so that they can be enforced. And so what does this start to look like? So really from an architecture standpoint, if you start to think about this concept of session and context, it also then bleeds into kind of the larger piece of the pie on the enforcement side. So what you'll find is, and this is abstracted to just talk about how you actually do this. This is not a Cloudintit centric pitch, but specifically, you've got to have some type of digital identity plane, right? We've spoken through this. You've got to have the authentication, the data store. You have to have the user self-service. The integration components have to be there. What's interesting is, this is where you start to kind of break apart some of that heritage environment. There's usually legacy pieces in place, but you also need to start modernizing. The second part of that is getting into this concept of some type of authorization control plane. How do you start to get into this fine-grained authorization? You know, from an OAuth standpoint, 2.0 and 2.1 are the standards everyone's leaning into aggressively. I think 2.1 is a bit more fit for purpose. This is where you start to see the integration with your CIM system, integration with your privacy and consent system, be it OneTrust or something else we were talking about before. And some of these emerging terms like API governance could be in the gateway, could be a spreadsheet, there's some hybrid in between. But more importantly, it's really about the service integration and making sure you're enabling what the business is trying to do, back to that airplane analogy. What's also highly relevant here is how do you start to get the analytics, right? So effectively, we just talked through the 3 A's we always have, but in a cloud native way: authentication, authorization, and audit. So you've got to have actionable analytics. Now, from a BI standpoint or ML threat detection, this could be fed into a SIM. You could use Splunk, you could use Exabeam to go track some of this stuff. So there's different ways you can do it, or you can just kick it into a dashboard if it's more of a passive monitoring. The relevance here is you're going to throw off a whole lot of log files. And because things are starting to move at machine speed in cloud native environments, you've got to make sure that there's some type of visibility to that data set, right? Don't underestimate that, right? So that's a big piece. And then finally, if you start to look at some of the legacy stuff, you've got a gateway, along with this concept of a micro perimeter authorizer or a micro proxy that sits inside of a container. So as things start to go to the edge and you start to really push stuff out, it's really leaning into how do you integrate with either the API security gateway that's there, coupled with how do you actually start to do policy enforcement at the edge. So LJ, I'll pause there if you want to talk a bit more on some of the architecture here, maybe a little bit with the team, what's working, what's not, where's the difficulty, and where should they spend most of their cycles?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So, well, in fact, this is the most typical, decomposition of the complete security. Well, maybe not entirely complete security infrastructure because we don't have skill like WAFs and things like that. But this is how we believe it should look. So identity, you will find identity, something that is called identity plane here. We'll find it everywhere, like IAMs, CIAMs, with all these things that all these functions that are mentioned here, like self-service, administration, etc. And ACP, that this, in the like if there is a data control plane and the data plane, control plane, then there is also authorization control plane that is a response to the authorization for for your microservices users and for the edge, and the Pyron and microperimeter here. These are the names that we use, but basically the Pyron is like API gateway that is at the edge. But a part of the edge, you need also security applied to each of your microservices. To just make life harder for the insider attacks. So then microperimeter is like the microperimeter for each of your services. And yes, and the analytics that just can take all this information, process it, and give you some insights of what's going on or fit a system that can react to that.
Yes, yeah. Yes. And so, to what LJ was talking through, this is where you start to get some of the visualization. And, this is just an elastic dashboard. Folks can use whatever is appropriate to their own environment, but don't underestimate, specifically as identity practitioners, the relevance of a lot of the data that's coming out of this stuff, especially as we start to move towards zero trust. Right? So basically, how do you start to think about the visualization of everything that has access happening, both from a user standpoint, but as well as machine to machine? And again, there's two sides to this coin that we started the conversation with, specifically as you start to think about session and context, which is there's a lot of know your customer data. And sometimes it doesn't all sit inside of your CIM tool or inside your privacy consent tool, but you can start to aggregate this down based on the log files that are coming out for who's accessing what and when, right? We're familiar with that one. But conversely, the risk mitigation, how do you make sure that you don't have anomalistic behavior? And we've thought about this, internal to organizations for quite some time. From a UEBA standpoint, this is really starting to look at from scale, how do you get that trending data? So with that, we'll pause. I guess one more thing here. If we start to think about, how do you accelerate the innovation? And we've got time here for a quick demo if folks are interested, but we'll hit this real quick and then we'll take a pause. If you want to move faster, which is really the punchline of session and context, it's really what identity practitioners need to lean into. There's a couple of things that you need to be mindful of. One is don't plan on ripping out all the infrastructure you have, right? You've got an IDP, use it from an orchestration and automation standpoint. If you've got solid MFA in place, keep rolling with it. You don't necessarily need to pull these pieces out. If your gateway is functioning properly, use it, but realize you might need to expand it a little bit or extend it, if you will, so they can start to do policy enforcement inside the container instead of always having to make a round trip. APIs that are in place, again, make sure you've got a good categorization of them and you know how they're actually being called, what they're doing, so you can do the policy enforcement. And this one on privacy and consent, right? We've seen this become a much hotter topic really in the last 6 months. A lot of it has to do with, we all got forced to go virtual. We're all on Zoom. And so making sure that the right folks are accessing the right data at the right time, and you're not cross-sharing is a big one. Externalized authorization, we've thought about this in the past, but it's becoming a much more significant topic, specifically because as you look at policy enforcement, you have to start pushing to the edge. And then simplify compliance, automate everywhere possible. So, when you start to think through how do you check these down, a couple of big topics, and then LJ, I'll hand it your way to help wrap it up and see if there's any Q&A at the end here. But basically, normalize the data and push towards standards. We know that, right? Being a snowflake makes it difficult. It's great for a one-off, but difficult to manage. Start to lean into how do you externalize authorization so you don't have to keep refactoring. And then finally, start to think about authorization as code. Goes through InfoSec much faster if every dev team isn't rewriting their own stuff. So I'll pause there. LJ, anything you want to say kind of in wrapping on the technical side, sir?
I think it's all, you've included everything that
excellent
is relevant.
And from a Q&A standpoint, we're always happy to follow up with anything. If anyone has any questions, Cloudentit, we've been in the identity space and the evolution to the cloud space, so always happy to help lean out and cover if any questions folks have. And then, I'll ask from your standpoint, anything else you'd like us to cover here, sir?
Yes. So one thing probably if you can cover how the Cloudentit fits into this picture that you were explaining. You were talking about this digital control plane, entity plane, and how the Cloudentit fits into this, and across the cloud native infrastructure with the microservices, then service mesh, API gateway. So where does the Cloudentit fits in?
That's a great question. Great question. So, from where we have functionality, we do sit across everything in this space. However, we take more of a partner first approach. And so from a digital identity plane, we're big advocates that if someone has an identity or IDP platform in place, stick with it, keep using it. From a Pyron standpoint, it's our version of a gateway, but basically if you've got Apogee, if you have Calling, if you have MuleSoft, use it, don't rip and replace it. There's a lot of good stuff happening there. Our secret sauce is really on the authorization control plane component, and then also the micro proxy, or what we call micro perimeter, where you can do the policy enforcement inside of a container. So these two pieces are really the secret sauce that we have that help drive innovation, because basically it goes back to that enhance and expand. And so we can help front end some legacy stuff that maybe is either on-prem with some of our customers, some of it's in a managed host environment, and they're trying to get into a multi-cloud, more elastic way. And so by our ability to do policy enforcement at the edge and to externalize authorization, our authorization control plane and our micro perimeter are the two pieces that we lean into most aggressively to answer your question.
So basically, your cloud, the identity plane is running on the cloud, and from the gateway, you intercept the request and connects to the cloud to do authorization. Is that the way it works? So you push the policies from cloud to the gateway itself. How does it work?
Prolaf, so yes, it was like that, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be in the cloud, basically, because, like I said earlier, we're also covering the open banking use cases, and it can be installed on-prem. Like the entire thing can be on-prem. The enforcement is always close to the service. So if you have the microservices infrastructure, you can just apply the microparameters. So we will automatically add micro proxies to each of your services, so that we control basically what data about the user, or what data basically, what PII each service is getting, because we will not let, for example, so developers who are developing a service, they will not be able to process certain data, and we will not inject more data that the service requires. Will not make it. We create zero trust network as well between the services, so no one will be able to make a call from the outside. Any insider who is not authorized to do that. As well as we have the enforcement at the edge that is here as a pylon that sits in front of all these microservices that you can have access from outside. And the pylon is is between the thanks to pylon, you can expose your services to the developers, as well as to the any consumers that you have, internal ones as well. And there is the ACP that is actually glue that is a glue for of everything here, which it connects identity, it connects your security infrastructure, it connects the enforcement, right? So, for example, if you have WAF, we can consume from the WAF some certain signals about the bot attacks, for example, and we will take it into account while during authorization at the API level, right? So we're in the center, basically.
Okay. So you mentioned that you are injecting a proxy to each service. So is that your own proxy, or you use Envoy?
It's a mixed model, actually. Like, we have our own proxy, but this is based on the one of the leading proxies for in Golang. It's super fast as well. It's like it adds like a millisecond, in certain cases to it's really low latency gateway proxy, excuse me.
So anything planned to like integrate with Envoy STO?
Yeah, we have this integration as well, but this is this is just one of the sub products that we have. You can say that, because not every customer wants this, right? We just went into this discussion about the microservices, but there is a couple other things as well that we do.
Yeah, so there's another question from Alan. You mentioned limited time authorizations. What about explicit revocation, and how do you support redelegation?
Explicit, excuse me, I'm not sure whether I understand.
Yeah, you mentioned about limited time authorizations.
Limited time authorization.
How about the explicit revocation of that? Yeah.
So limited time authorizations, in fact, for like we have like if you're talking about stateless authorization, where the token is issued and is valid for a limited time, it can be done that way, as well as you can have the policy at the API gateway that applied at the Pyron that basically will will enforce that, that something is valid for X amount of hours. And revocation, speaking about the revocation, yes, so then for the stateless cases, you need to have some blacklist then, right? For sure. We actually currently we are supporting the model, this active model, where you have basically we're just contacting the contacting the authorization server. I mean, I'm speaking about the edge case, right? I mean, the case when the request hits the edge, right? So then we verify whether the token is still valid, because, for example, this is a common case in the open banking cases, and you need to anyways check that because this is not the stateless token. And speaking about the internal calls between the services, we issue really, really short-lived tokens, right? So the revocation is not the case there. You can talk about the certificate revocation.
Yeah, I think that's what we see too. Like even like if you look at this Netflix deployment, so they use MTLS between services, and they don't worry about revocation. They go for like short-lived certificates.
So this solution that the microparameter can get you don't need MTLS there. So that's the case, right? With this solution, you don't need MTLS because you don't need to have the complexity of setting up MTLS. So this is a bit different approach that Istio takes if you run only microparameter, like if you take it from us, basically. But we support how do I, excuse me, I forgot the name of it. We support SPIFFE, basically, SPIFFE addressing. We don't, not everything is same as in Istio when you just take it when you use the microparameter products only.
So it's a service to service authentication. You don't support MTLS at the proxy level?
We don't require that, right? So which means that if you have a couple of services and you want them to talk to each other and you want to create zero trust network, we don't need to set up MTLS between them, right? Because like take into account that we do API level authorization, which means that we don't just secure service to service communication. We secure service to API communication, so that I can set a policy and say, this service can call this API with this parameter, but the other service and the other service can call the other API with different parameter set. So you're not gonna get that with MTLS. And basically, we're just sending the authorization with the keys or the tokens, excuse me, between services, but this doesn't require MTLS. So
these tokens, like, is it a JWT that you send between services? So how do you?
Short-lived ones, yes, short-lived ones, and these JWTs they carry the user context information as well, that is provided by the edge gateway.
But JWT, it's mostly it's a bearer token, right? So if it is not TLS, then someone can reuse it.
It's going through the it's still TLS. I'm not saying it's not TLS, right?
Okay, so you're using TLS but not MTLS, is that?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. Not MTL. We don't do MTLS. So we free you from setting up MTLS, basically.
Okay, so the pattern we have seen is, so basically the service authentication happens, so MTLS, then the user context is passed through the JWT.
Yes, the user context is passed through JWT, and at the edge gateway, you can do injection of the user attributes or any other contextual attributes that you need, right? But then you have a control. You can control which service should get which information, as well as which service should be able to make calls to API of the other service, right? So
yeah. But when you like so the JWT, like so, let's say like a scenario. So the request comes to the gateway, right? So the gateway will create a JWT and pass it to the service, right? In the service, you have the proxy intercepts the request, validate the JWT. Now this service needs to talk to another service, right? Another upstream service. So are you passing the same JWT you got from the gateway?
No.
Would generate a new JWT at the service side?
That's a new JWT, but it will retain the information that is passed through.
Okay, so basically still like even though you are not using MTLS, you still need to provision keys to each service, right? To generate, it's like self-issued JWT.
Yes, we have a bootstrapping. There's a bootstrapping happening. You know, you can have a look at these the docs Cloudentit.com. We have this described over there. And this is one of the innovative things that we do, basically, right? So, you know, let's see whether the broader market is gonna apply these patterns, right? Because out of all these things that we do, I think that this is one of the ones that is really innovative.
Is that where you are using this SPIFFE JWT switch?
We use SPIFFE addressing, right? So we comply with SPIFFE in that.
That's the JWT suite, right? With SPIFFE. So SPIFFE has a 609 suite and JWT suite. So if you are using JWT between services, probably it's a JWT suite, right?
I wouldn't say it's total. I mean, I'm not able to confirm now. Let me put it that way, whether it's done that way.
There's another question from Alan. How do you support redelegation? I think this is related to his previous question too.
Redelegation, meaning
not Alan. If you can elaborate on the chat. Yeah. Till then we can. So you have demo plan too, right?
Yes. Aren't we already behind? No.
No, we have time.
Am I good? If you want, yeah, go for it, LJ.
Okay.
I'll stop sharing.
All right. So this is just, let me just walk through the authorization control plane. That again this is the glue of between the identities, your security infrastructure enforcement. So again, look, we have here a workspace, because I got to the admin portal. This is some demo instance. I can add the identities, which means that I can connect to, you know, where your users, I can connect to basically to location, to the place to the IDP where your users are located. So we can select one of these IDPs. So from here, you will be taking users, right? User identities will be coming from here. Oh, this is logged out now. So services, you just configure your services. So let's say here are some financial services configured. For each service, I can create APIs. So you can see that this is a combination of the authorization server and APIs and identities, right? So we have this intersection of these three things here. So I have APIs, and to each API, I have, there are policies applied to some of these APIs. Of course, there are also the privacy, there are also privacy tags, and I'm connecting to the gateways, like over here, you know, I can add the Byron, Amazon or Azure gateways and connect to them, set them up. So depending where your APIs are, you can discover them by connecting to these gateways and apply policies. And I have applications, so consumer applications that will be connecting to this APIs, will be consuming these APIs. And I will switch here to policies, where I have policies where I can configure policies out of these building blocks. Like let's say over here we integrate with signal sciences. So if signal sciences tells us that there is a Tor traffic, then we will require a NIST2 policy. And while if the traffic doesn't contain Tor, it's not Tor traffic, then the AAL1 AAL1 will be enough. So basically, you will have to do MFA if you come from the suspicious network. But you can add, additional, of course, validators in here. This is all Jasen, so you can just. It's not like this is only done through the UI. So such a policy can be applied to API, right? Or this policy can be applied to the underlying authorization server that is associated with one of these workspaces that are here. So in order to, for example, to issue token, you can set that you need to meet some policy in order to token to be issued. So for example, you can check some user attributes like user risk level, things like that. So you can do this in the stateless fashion or in a stateful fashion where you just make some calls at the or you can apply policy during token minting or token or API consumption. And of course, this is an authorization server associated with each workspace that you can see here. That means that you can, of course, this financial open banking related options as well here that you can tick, and other, some claims mappings, things like that. And to add to that, we have the analytics as well, right? So this is what we've been talking about. Like we export this we fit Elastic with that in this case. And so you can see this, there's a business analytics. So how many of your consumers is using which flows your consumers are using, from where they are coming, as well as the threat analytics, where you have the information about failed Pixie requests or failed Pixie requests or failed authorization requests, basically. Things like that. I mean, this data is not perfect. Excuse me about that. It doesn't look that great, but we could do a better job with that. Probably we auto-generate that here, so it's not like super cool. But basically, you get information about any suspicious activity that is related to authorization that you wouldn't get otherwise, because like many tools are not even security tools are not even getting into this to this level of they don't look into layer 7, but also they are not so well communicated with the authorization server. So this is this short overview. So it is in the middle of between identity, security, enforcement, and that between that there's no 4 component.
Yeah, was that helpful? Want to be mindful of time here.
Yeah. Yes. So there's a question. So Alan explains his question. This redelegation. So Alice gets a token and needs Bob to act on her behalf. How does she authorize Bob? So probably this matches to the use case I explained. Like, so you get from Alice invokes an API, right? Then that request goes to, let's say, foo microservice. So foo microservice has a token from Alice, and it will validate it. And then foo needs to talk to another microservice called bar. Right? So how that redelegation works? Is there a token exchange? Or,
and the Alice makes a call on behalf of Bob, right? Is this?
Yes.
Is this the case? Yeah. So so you know, if you so you can inject this information in the edge gateway, for example, right? Where the Alice, if Alice makes a call on behalf of, then you know, then this microservice can get this information that this is happening, right? So this is one of the options. I'm not saying this is the best one.
Sure. Yeah. I think we don't have any more questions. Yeah, so thank you very much. I think this is a very informative session, and we'll share the link to the recording with everyone in the meetup.
Excellent.
And then again, thank you, Jason and Łukasz, for sharing your insights. And also thank you very much, everyone who joined, and looking forward to meet you at our next meetup. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.
Bye.